and it
Oh
really
no.
effed him up.
Let's see. Lubabalu. Again, I'm butchering that name. Says my brother. I'm working on my zone 6, but there's a zone 4-3 going on next door. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but yeah, man, my zones are all flared up these days too. So hello, beautiful people. Mark, Magdalena, good to see you.
Hi there.
Hey,
Good to be here.
Yeah,
good to
yeah,
see you people.
it's lovely to be with you guys, especially since we took last month off. So it's awesome to reconnect. And before we jump into today's topic, which just to let people know, we're going to be sort of having a loose conversation about an integral approach to immigration. Not even really an integral approach, but more like just our own integral views and perspectives, and bringing our own values to bear to the challenges of immigration. I know Magdalena has just a ton to say about this, and so I really look forward to the discussion. But before we begin, I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge the passing of our dear friend Terry Patton, who just passed away. I believe it was last night, after struggling with cancer for the last year. And it is, man, this man, I tell you, he brought so much love and passion and insight and diligence to the Integral Project for Jesus, just as long as I've been here. I've been here for next year will be 20 years. And if I recall correctly, Terry was one of the people I met way back in the early years when we were just getting this thing off the ground. And I am just really missing this man. I'm really missing this man. He made such an impact on so many people, on so many hearts in the integral space. And sitting here in the seat that I'm in, here in Integral Land, whenever we lose someone like this, it just it cuts so deep. It cuts so deep. I mean, here's a generation of just amazing seekers and leaders and practitioners who devoted their lives to not just waking up for themselves, but also inviting the rest of us to awaken alongside them. And they bent their lives around walking that path alongside us. And so when we lose one of these people, one of these
Giants.
just absolute giants, one of these just massive hearts, it hurts both to lose the individual. It hurts for me individually to lose the person, and then I feel it like it hurts for the space. You know what I mean? Like I can feel the impact on the integral culture itself, and everything that we try to do to connect and to emerge together as a cultural force. When we lose a leader like this, it cuts deep. And I just feel myself feeling I find myself feeling just so tremendously grateful for the relationships that I am privileged enough to have with folks like you guys, with people like Terry, with folks like Ken and Diane and Jeff Salzman, and just so many luminaries. And it's easy when we are sort of surrounded by our comforts to take for granted the fact that we are surrounded by absolutely beautiful, amazing, wonderful people we don't always agree with 100% of the time. People watching our program don't agree with us 100% of the time. That's completely fine, because we are all in a very real way in this together. We are all pushing this thing in the same direction. And yeah, so I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate Terry Patton, and just let everyone know how much I am going to miss the man. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of you out there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I met Terry at uh, that original integral workshop with Fred Kaufman,
Yeah.
and he was there as a student, as was I. And seeing him through the years, I would go back. I was like, Terry, you remember that time, because Terry was struggling. He was struggling with his expression in the world. And I remember, and he was out about it, and and you could tell he was a big player on the scene at one point, and the Adi-Da years and all of that. But there was this struggle going on, and I just remember vividly Ken inviting him up to the loft, like, let's do some writing together.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Integral Life Practice, that book,
That was the
started
seed.
to come. The seed was there, and Terry just took off. Like, his bud just burst. And seeing him, over the years at Integral conferences, and then last time we connected was I had a podcast called Wicked Discussions, and he came on, and reading A New Republic of the Heart was like this just fierce energy and power of a human that was like, I'm going to change the fucking world. And he did. And he had that energy and power and integrity. There was fierce integrity with Terry, and
Yes.
He didn't mince words, and he didn't suffer fools, and he would call people out. And I loved him, and I love him now. And I wrote on Facebook today that, when I grow up, I want to be Terry Patton. And I mean that. I was saying that to Nicole yesterday when we went to Aurora's Halloween parade at school, and I left. Nummely did a beautiful gathering yesterday where hundreds came together for Terry. And that's what I said to Nicole when I was driving away. I was crying a little bit. I was just like, God, it's one of, if I could do in some of the ways how Terry has touched lives and bringing that fierce energy of awakening, that's where it's at. So I have tremendous respect and love for Terry Patton, and I miss him already.
Yeah.
So may his transition be one where we all learn from, and may his transition be peaceful, and as he lives in the in-between now.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Thank you, Mark. All right. Well, Magdalena, did you have anything? I'm not sure if you had a relationship with Terry or not. If you have anything you'd like to say, please feel free.
Yeah, so Terry was a regular at the Integral European conferences, which are
Right.
international, in fact. And he was a speaker there. And in 2008, he was there. So I met him there, and he gave this very, very powerful, as you're saying, passionate speech. It really energized the room. And the core of what he was telling everyone in his book, The New Republic of the Heart, that I have also read, and I read a little bit before coming on today as well. The core message is about social, political, and environmental justice. And that we are really in this time, this very, very unique time where we have to make these stark decisions about which direction do we have to go. And we're making these decisions as humanity, one way or another. And the fact that these integral ideas or practices that we have come up with together are part of that, are going to influence that. That now, and interestingly, he was talking about creating the meta space, the meta community, the community of practice, that is going to take us to the next generation, take us, hopefully, if there are no unjust mistakes along the way. So yeah, I definitely come into this conversation with that in mind, with that idea of what he's bringing to that we can create a new Republic of the Heart.
Yes.
And that means something, that it's not just a community that we have amongst ourselves and now we feel this deep loss, because this great person has passed, but that this is also with his legacy and with his knowledge we can create in our larger and broader communities within states and in between states, and then even a republic that encompasses all of humanity as a whole. That's his contribution. That's what I'm carrying with me. So I feel today, especially, I want to speak more from the heart, even though I tend to, kind of get prepared and want to cognitively talk about facts and ideas, and those things will come up. I really want to dedicate today to speaking from the heart.
Beautiful. Thank you, Magdalena. Well, here's to Terry Patton, one of the original integral justice warriors. May the work that we do together live up to the incredible bar that he set for all of us.
Yeah.
Blessings.
Amen.
To Terry. Yep. Blessings. All right. Well, as Terry finds his way, to the higher realms, you could say he's on his own path of migration right now. Maybe this is an opportunity to introduce our next topic, which is indeed one of the greatest, most pressing, most challenging, and complicated life conditions that's facing us today, and that's immigration. And, obviously, immigration has been a challenge for human societies ever since human society first emerged, right? I mean, clearly there has always been a lot of conflict and friction and tension between different groups of people trying to figure out how to coexist with each other, especially when, there's shared resources at play, shared boundaries, etc. This has always been a problem in our civilization from the very beginning. And yet now, when we have other life conditions that are beginning to weigh down on us, things like climate change, right, which is making entire regions of the world uninhabitable. And as things like water become increasingly scarce, and a lot of people are predicting that we're going to see a big transition from oil wars to something like water wars, which is terrifying to think about. And when you think about how much forced migration, how much this is going to force populations to move and to relocate, this is an incredibly difficult challenge. And it's one that I think has become, really, really prevalent in the political arenas, particularly over the last 5, 6, 7 years. So this is going to be the discussion we have today. We're going to see, what might be a little bit different about the integral sensibility when it is brought to bear on these problems, as opposed to, maybe we can even talk about sort of standard amber views and values around immigration, orange, green, etc., so that we can have, maybe something to compare an integral response to. But I just want to say from the outset, this is another one of those conversations that's just so, there's so many moving parts that intersect in such complicated ways that after an hour and a half, I think we're just going to begin scratching the surface of the discussion, but I'm hoping that we can have a conversation that's at least conducive to creating a space, as we often say, where new solutions, new ideas, new perspectives can emerge between us and our audience. So that's my hope for the conversation today.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, it's such a gargantuan topic that, we're going to just scratch the surface in an hour and a half. And it's certainly my intention. I hope that we start to take a look in a way where something new emerges, through our process, our dialectical process, that points us in the right direction, because, these problems, they're not, as you eloquently said, climate change is impacting all of this. Ethnocentric attitudes impact all of this. Just all kinds of environmental related issues impact this. So it's a wicked problem, and so I'm excited to have the conversation. That again, of course, I curse you both at the beginning of the month when I think about.
I don't know why we keep doing this to ourselves.
Just like, what? and like we're going to talk about abortion next time or
Yeah,
something.
like can we just talk about Dune for an hour or something? I mean,
Yeah, let me get on that show with you and Ryan, and like let's like watch some TV shows together, and
hey man, that show's not a cakewalk either. All right.
No, I know. True, I've watched it, and I bow my head to you every time, and Ryan. So, but it does seem like a little bit more fun. Okay.
Fair enough.
Well, I think we can unpack a bit why people have such strong feelings and why this is so difficult, like why it has become such a polarizing subject, considering, as you have said, Corey, that migration is literally the history of humanity.
Yeah.
We are migratory human species. And yet it has become such a polarized subject over time.
Yeah.
So I think we can make it easier on ourselves, is what I'm saying. What I'm saying, Mark, is that unpacking, getting to the layers of the discomfort, I think, is part of the integral contribution.
Yeah.
Rather than just the back and forth points of that we see on the news and so on, which is also interesting to talk about.
It is. Yeah, it is, especially as it's sort of typically presented as this false equivalence between like total and complete isolationism on one side, or like this figment of open borders on the other. And it's like, this is where the cultural conversation sort of gets stuck. It gets paralyzed between these two extreme poles, which, as far as I can tell, not many actual people in positions of power on either the right or the left are advocating. So there's sort of this false dilemma between sort of the open borders or the completely 100% closed borders that we often see represented in media. And Magdalena, I see you kind of shaking your head, so maybe you have a different view here.
Well, the idea of the open borders, I am coming from Europe. Europe is the European Union, at least, is institutionally a union of states that have open borders. So open borders is not such a radical idea. It really is possible between states that have developed some kind of interconnection, whether it's historical or institutional or political or economic, very much so in the European Union. So, but what's interesting in that, and what I have been studying over the years, is the underlying root of why individuals can get to that point where they can trust each other enough to have these open borders. Now, that's not to say that Europe is like this perfect example of open borders, not by any means. And obviously COVID has affected that, where all borders have been closed around the world, and we can talk about the effect of that a little bit. So, but I think, and guess what I'm trying to say is that even the isolationist aspect or the open border aspect will have some deep rooted ideas and emotions that themselves are valid in some ways that we need to consider, and that is the integral perspective, rather than just the points like, oh, you want open borders and that's a terrible thing and you're isolationist and you don't. We can say, well, why are these values important, and are they realistic, and is it something that through these integral practices like the dialectical process we can get to some kind of a resolution?
Yeah, if I could just real briefly, Meg, I just want to double click that, because that's such an important point. It's something I find myself returning to over and over again, is reminding myself that what we have here, whenever we have a strong reaction to something like immigration, or even like the pandemic or masks or vaccination, what have you, we sort of can look at this in two ways. We can look at sort of the views that are out there, and chances are there's a lot of views out there that we 100% disagree with. Like, there's no overlap between my view and your view. However, if we take the time and we have enough curiosity and we have enough epistemic humility to take another perspective, chances are we can find a few of the animating values beneath those views that's bringing sort of life to those views in the first place. And that's where we can find a lot of overlap. Whether those values are something that here in Integral we would color code as like, oh, that's an amber value and that's an orange value, whatever it is, these are all still alive within us. And I think that this is the opportunity for us to just pause and reflect and to step beyond the views that are presenting ourselves to us and try to contact the underlying values, because that's where I think a lot more common ground can be found between us.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, Mark, you're on mute.
Sorry. I find it really interesting because it's so complex. Like, there's a lot of irony when it comes to immigration and like who's for it and who's against it when it comes to, certainly the undocumented. And I think about like in the United States, like, like open border leftists, right, are standing arm in arm with exploitative employers, right, in the agribusiness, construction business, hospitality industry, and you got them standing arm in arm together. And then, like on another side, you got pro-labor liberals, right, concerned about unskilled laborers coming into the country, taking their jobs, and they stand arm in arm with like white nationalists who don't want people coming into the United States and that have anything that aren't of white European descent. And it's just like, and then you've got like the environmentalists who were at one point like really not for immigration because of the numbers of folks pouring into land, but then it became politically incorrect to say things like that. So they just talk about how we need to limit the number of Americans having children, and so it's like, this is what's going on. And so I don't think you can necessarily do a developmental or you can't define this just based on development, because people are arm in arm on this. They don't want to be arm in arm necessarily, like but you are supporting the same thing, and maybe for different reasons. And I just think that adds a little spice to this conversation.
It does. Yeah. Strange bedfellows and odd coalitions. And yeah, no, it's kind of bizarre when you look at it that way.
Yeah.
Well, I think with the nation state system that we have developed over the centuries, I suppose, has given us is a sense of identity about who we are.
Yes.
And this is where we delineate different borders, because those identities in history have moved. Groups have moved, tribes have moved. There's always been, this is what I'm saying, there's always been migration. But at some point, people settled and said, okay, this is what we're calling this place. This is the idea of who we are. And now strangers and foreigners that are coming in and out, or where we're moving somewhere else, we need rules around that.
Yep.
And there's different rules. There's rules around hospitality, that welcoming the strangers. I mean, this is very much ingrained in different spiritual traditions of you welcome the stranger, you love the stranger, but also with a sense of caution about getting to know who they are. And progressively over generations, this has developed to what we now have as national laws concerning immigration or migration and asylum, as international laws and so on. So I just want to say from the offset that I am coming from the migrant perspective, because I am originally from Poland. We had a migratory childhood. We were refugees in Italy, so this is very much ingrained into my self-identity. So my self-identity wasn't as much nationality based. Of course it is. I'm Polish, I'm Canadian and these things, but it was very much migratory in that whole refugee experience. And it is also the career choice that I made in working for international organizations with refugees, with migrants, with trafficked persons. So it's forced migration, voluntary migration, different types. And as I went through that process over the years and decided to look at things from an academic perspective, what I have done in my research is actually applied social psychology, or we could say integral parts of integral psychology as well, to an understanding of why these international systems of migration exist. And it relates to what we're talking about. And there's these points. One is identity formation. We create national legislation of who's in and out based on identity. And that always is something that we can see in the legislation. The other one is threat perception. Perceiving the other as a potential threat. And I say that, the border, now we have all kinds of things at the border, especially the US border right now. I mean, there's potentially a new migrant caravan that is coming from Central America. And I've been following some of the more conservative news outlets of the reaction. If you Google migrant caravan, you'll only get like Fox News and PragerU that have very strong opinions about the migrant caravan, whereas other outlets not so much. They're just saying there's a movement and it's not really a crisis. So the way I look at borders, for example, is where identity and threat meet.
Mm.
And that's how we can think of it from like a psychological perspective, because otherwise what are they? What are borders? We've sort of imagined that we have this space, that we own this space, and it belongs to us because we're a community that has defined ourselves under a set of values that we call, our constitutional laws and so on. So, and that's not something that's really discussed, and I think in like public discourse about immigration, that why are these borders so important to us? Why, when I again Googled the migrant caravan that's coming to the U.S. border, Prager University, which is a very right-leaning platform. The whole segment that they have on this is build a wall.
Mm-hmm.
That's the solution. You want a solution? You build a wall. You just keep people out. There's insiders and outsiders. This is how we think of the world. And yes, some persons, you said, Mark, they're undocumented. They're in the U.S. right now. Well, some of them will have to give them amnesty. This is again from PragerU that they're saying. We'll have to give them amnesty, and they can stay, but not citizenship. Not citizenship, because citizenship means a belonging. And the reason we wouldn't give them a citizenship, according to PragerU, is because they came here illegally. They didn't follow our laws. They didn't value us, and so they don't deserve it. It's a sense of deserving. So it's this very very strong sense of insiders and outsiders.
Mm.
And I think that's what we are contending with when we are bringing forth an integral perspective, a world-centric perspective, where we're radically inclusive, and we do want to break some of these boundaries. We want to have a socially just system where we recognize that a lot of the reasons for people migrating in the first place are contributed by the countries to which they're migrating to.
That's right.
The US is an example.
Yeah, we've got some karma.
Example. Yeah, so we were talking about Afghanistan and the Afghan refugees. There is more of a sense of responsibility to the Afghan refugees, I think, from the US and other countries, because there's a sense that, well, we contributed to the chaos, so we have to take care of the people. But there isn't as much of an understanding of how that also has impacted other countries.
Yeah.
How that interdependence that creates migratory movements in the first place.
Yep.
So
real quick, because I think you made again another important point that I just want to kind of double click here is the different kinds of strategies that we see emerging for problems like this coming from different sections of the population. So on the one hand, we have, conservative solutions, which are often, but not always, it's very important to always say this, often, but not always, involve a style of reasoning that we might call direct causation. If there's a problem, there's a direct solution for it. People are coming through the borders. The solution is to build a wall to prevent people from coming in the borders. That's an example of direct causation. Then you have another, which we often see from the political left, again, not always, but usually around particular issues, which is more of systemic causation. And to me, I think of like Barack Obama when he said, the best border, the best immigration policy we can have in the southern border is a healthy Mexican economy. That's the best possible border control we can hope for on our southern border. If we help Mexico to become a thriving, vibrant economy, then we're going to see naturally fewer people coming through Mexico to end up in America. I think that's a great example. And also all of these considerations about the karmas, what has American foreign policy done to actually create these problems in the first place, to create these waves of migrants that are trying to escape their country and find their way to a country like America. All of this, I think, is part of a more systemic causation, but that's a lot more difficult to put on a bumper sticker, right?
Yeah.
Than something like build a wall, which I think appeals to a sort of an almost like reptilian part of our nervous system, where we're like, yeah, that's how you stop a problem. None of this wishy-washy systemic crap. If you want to stop a problem, you put something in between them and us. And I think an integral response.
And you send them to jail.
Both. Yeah, and you
send
send
them to jail.
That's right.
Right. That's right. And but this is really interesting, because if you deep dive even a little bit into Barack Obama, Senator Obama, Senator Clinton, and Senator Schumer voted for a 2-layer wall for 700 miles on the southern border with Mexico, which was just a little shorter than Trump's 1,000-mile wall, but with 1 layer less, actually, or 1 layer more than Trump's wall, which was 2 layers. And if you look, really prior to 2000 or the early 2000s, the Democrats in America, at least, were a lot less pro-immigration because they were the party of the American worker. And so you saw, President Clinton and President Carter both put commissions together looking at how to limit, illegal immigrants from getting into the country and because of this conflict. And I think that's kind of something at this stage in the process that we have to be really honest about, is that the way things are structured right now, and I think Magdalena is getting at this, but because there are structural issues, but the way it's structured right now, there are winners and losers in the immigration process. And until we get at that, and I'm happy to talk about some of the winning and losing aspects of it, until we get at that and restructure it, because there is a payoff for folks coming into our country, into the United States of America, which, again, classic, I don't know if you'd say irony, conflict, or, one hand or the other. We've kicked out more people than any other country in the world, not any other country in the world, excuse me. We've kicked out more people than we've let in, but we've also let in more than any other country in the world. So we've kicked out 57 million people, and that's an enormous number. But at the same time, we've let in more people than others. So there is some kind of payoff for some folks coming here. And until we can start to, getting again, I love always bringing up the cosmopolitan citizen, but that's what Magdalena's talking about. It's like, what do these borders really mean? Well, they mean something right now, but if we're going to get to the world-centric space and cosmocentric awareness, then we are going to see that these borders don't really mean as much as we move in a way where we see the innate worth and dignity of all beings. And so, that's the rub. But right now, there are winners and losers, and that's a problem.
Yep.
That's a problem.
Yeah, just one little note that about the US taking in the higher share of, and it depends what kind of migration, right? Because it's possibly through the so-called regular channels of migration, the US may have taken in significantly more than other countries. When it comes to refugees, however, it has not. And in fact, refugees are dispersed around the world, mostly primarily in developing countries. So they're going to neighboring countries. They're not going, across the world or something. Is really exceptionally that they are in the US and developed states. And this is one of the problems that, let's say, critics of asylum or refugees have, is that people are jumping the queue. They're supposed to be resettled. They're supposed to go through the camp experience, and then we get to pick and choose. And it creates these dichotomies of the good migrant and the bad migrant, who are the desirable and who are the undesirable. And who do we feel enough compassion to, and we have vetted and done through the whole process to welcome, and who is just showing up as if uninvited, and we get to turn them away. So and the process really isn't meant to work like that. Asylum is asylum. If they come to the border, the process is supposed to work the same way. And in fact, most of the less developed countries around the world have been carrying the bulk of the weight. And it really is ultimately a class issue, because even though here I am praising the European Union, saying, yes, there's open borders and we've developed, and Europe has developed the society where people can travel freely. Freedom of movement is one of the highest ideals between the states. However, there's something called Fortress Europe, and the border has become very defined, especially now that the Eastern European countries have become part of the European Union. Then you have, some of these war-ridden countries like Ukraine or Bosnia or Belarus, where there's conflicts, and the borders are coming up. So they're also starting to build walls and fences and so on. And of course, there's the natural border of the Mediterranean Sea, where people are dying to get through. And there's consistent pushbacks by the authorities of people that are going through. So it's generally, I think, a system set up around who do we want and who do we don't want.
Yeah.
Who is welcome as being one of us, and who isn't. And this is where issues of severe discrimination come in. This is where labels of racism come in. This is where labels of discrimination against socioeconomically disadvantaged persons or others are of particular issues. And again, I've developed laws around that, so I might come back to that, but I think that's the fundamental issue. How do we value a value of the human being? Mark, you're saying dignity. We're supposed to value human beings equally. We're supposed to welcome and cherish them and support them and so on. But however, there are these systems in place that essentially say some people are more valuable than others. That's what immigration or migration systems have developed into, an
Right.
evaluation of who we think is good for our society. And
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, please, I didn't mean to cut you off.
And this is how we're creating sort of very internally focused systems rather than more holistic, world-centric systems. This is what we have to get around, and this is where we have to dig deep, do our integral heart-based, emotion-based, morality-based work to really get past that kind of thinking. Because if I may, and I'm going to say it. I'm just gonna say it.
If you must.
I'm having a day. You know, a lot of these points come up in integral conversations in online about very, very strong anti-migration stance. This exists in the integral communities. It might be even the position of some of our listeners today. If you feel very strongly about more restrictive measures, more restrictive anti-migration measures. How do we get to a broader shared understanding that isn't undervaluing human beings that we should be caring about, which is the integral way?
Yes. No, well said, beautifully said. And I think one of the ways that we go about that is doing our best to, again, acknowledge the underlying value contradictions that a lot of these people are feeling that's animating their views. So, when we're talking about, sort of the picking and choosing among which immigrants we allow in versus which ones we don't. I mean, a lot of that in a lot of people's minds anyway, comes down to some notion of cultural compatibility. And I don't think that the left or the right really has sort of a good grasp on what to do with these notions of cultural compatibility. I remember a few weeks ago, there was a story of immigrants that we were allowing in from Afghanistan, right? Which obviously seems like the right thing to do considering the clusterfuck that we created there, right? So there's a karma. Here's a karma that we created. Here's sort of the consequence. There's a whole bunch of people who, we now want to allow back into the country. And there was resistance to that. And one of the points of resistance was that apparently some of these folks that were coming over from Afghanistan wanted to bring their child brides with them. And so there was this sudden uproar of like, what do we do about this? We obviously cannot allow that in our culture, but who are we to tell them that their culture is wrong? I mean, this is sort of the perspective coming from the left. Who are we to tell them that their culture is worse or less developed or less evolved than ours, because everything sort of gets on the same foot. And to me, this brings us to one of the central contradictions of the left around issues of immigration and really just around issues of multiculturalism in general, where I think that Green rightfully wants to move beyond sort of this orange assimilative mode of multiculturalism, where it's like we allow all people and all ethnicities as long as we all sort of come together into this new monoculture and we leave our sort of ethnic cultures, the idiosyncrasies from our ethnic cultures behind. Now sort of the orange assimilative mode. Green is just kind of like, well, we want to create a nice pluralism for as many people as possible. But within that pluralism, they don't quite yet know how to make room for the very real and very important ethnic differences between us. And I think that they're struggling to find a way to make a room for ethnic differences, which are oftentimes ethnocentric differences, right? They're trying to find a way to make room for that without themselves sort of regressing to ethnocentric modes of thinking. Which we see in things like essentialism, the idea that like only a person with this identity is allowed to make a comment about this identity. And this is a sort of a regressive force that we're seeing on the left. And I think a lot of it is coming from this very, very contradiction. We want to create a pluralism that embraces all people, but we don't actually know how to embrace all people because we are not giving ourselves permission to say, this kind of culture is a little bit more or maybe a little bit less developed than the other culture. Now, obviously, there's typologies here too. Sometimes cultures it's not a matter of more or less developed. It's just a matter of like different modes of sense making, different expressions of these values. Sometimes it is developmental. Sometimes there is a verticality here. And I don't think either side of our current sort of political constellation knows what to do with that. Should we allow people to come over with their child brides? Should we allow the child brides to come over and then enforce the law and say you're no longer this person's bride, despite what happened in your country of origin, despite your history together? I don't think we really know how to deal with those problems. So this issue of cultural compatibility, especially with civilization blocks that are just so very different from ours. We see this, I think, mostly with Muslim populations. There's a lot of hesitance in America to allow Muslim populations in, because we're afraid of this incompatibility somehow infecting our own culture and kind of beginning to break it down from the inside. Now, I think there are elements of this view that we want to properly acknowledge and integrate. And there's probably some parts that we really need to leave, by the wayside as well, which only goes to show how tremendously complicated this is. Because alongside sort of the identity piece and the threat piece that you laid out, Magdalena, is also just simple questions that, Mark, I think you were heading towards, about like, how do we distribute resources, right? I mean, one of the things about being a citizen is you have access to a certain kind of resource that non-citizens don't, sort of by necessity. We can't give food stamps to the entire world. We can't create a social safety web, right? A safety net that actually is all inclusive for anyone, whether or not they're a citizen. I mean, there's real sort of pragmatic, concerns here, economic concerns, et cetera, that we need to pay attention to. But yeah, it's frustrating to me whenever I see all of these kind of getting folded together, kind of getting reduced to each other whenever the conversation of immigration comes up in our national media.
Yeah, really well said. Like the paper of record, right? Like the New York Times, they're like so pro immigration that there's always, it's in their perspective, it's all win-win. And it's not at this point in history. Okay. It's not at this point until we get to a higher stage that Magdalena is pointing to, and start to reconsider what borders really mean, reconsider what it means to be a human being, and to take care of each other on that level. But, you're right. Like we have a welfare state, right? We have welfare, and who gets a piece of that pie? And what's really interesting is that the more homogenous countries, like the Nordic countries, they have like kind of universal welfare, right? A foundation. Whereas really ethnically diverse countries like us, the United States, Switzerland, they don't have as big of a welfare pie. And it has to do, and part of this is the issues of ethnocentrism, and relating that way. And because who's going to get a piece of that pie? I mean, you got pro-labor people like Eugene Debs, right? Back in the 30s, saying, the Dagos work for small pay and are far more like savages or wild beasts than even the Chinese, right? And so like, it's like, I don't want them coming in here to take away, from my folks who are getting this kind of labor. Cesar Chavez, the great Hispanic laborer who President Biden has a sculpture of him on his desk or in his office or something, denounced unauthorized immigrants because it enabled agribusiness to thwart his efforts to organize farm workers. And so, these aren't bad people, but it's because we've set up this system in a way where there are winners and losers that we are constantly, at war with that. And until we can, go a little deeper, until we can create, a true, one world, one space, that kind of reality, we're going to keep running into these problems. And, they're not going away. I mean, our immigrant population in the United States has just like taken off, right? I mean, it has really, really taken off. We've got 44.8 million immigrants in our country, 13.7% of our population. In 1960, we had 9.7 million, making up 5.4% of our population.
Wow.
That means we've doubled. We've doubled in terms of the density of immigrants in our country. And that's no commentary of good or bad, because obviously we know, immigrants have done wonderful things for for our country. We are a nation in many ways of immigrants. And then, but by 2065, according to Pew, it's projected to double its current population. So how are we going to deal with that, right? And maybe that's what Magdalena is saying, and maybe this is what's emerging, is that the idea of the nation state is kind of becoming more and more archaic. Is not really reflective of the reality. I mean, we even the way that we kind of like count humans in the United States, we have this very, very archaic way of doing it, where it's Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific, and then and one other. It's like, what is that? Like, what the fuck is that?
Right.
Like, shouldn't we be talking about like where you're from? Like who you actually are, instead of throwing you in these total archaic categories that don't even reflect, humanity. So I mean, I just see so much has got to change.
Yeah.
On this, to honor people. It's and I mean, you were talking about the differentiation, Magdalena, of humans and valuing some over others. Canada has done that to an extent. We've done that to an extent where, if you have certain skill sets, you're let into the country, and if you don't, you're not. And so, that's one way of kind of like limiting the welfare state, or the issue of the welfare, is you have it so that it's skills based about who's coming in. But that creates other issues, because we're not valuing all beings. We're valuing based on your skill. And so, the more I think about it, it's just a fucking mess. This is really, really tough stuff.
Yeah. I mean, of course, human beings, we categorize, but I think where we need to go is beyond imposing categories on others to actually finding out about others.
Mhm.
And there's a difference. And I also want to be sure that in our conversation and with listeners, and whatever conversation may come afterwards from this, is that we're clear that when we are taking different perspectives in our conversations, it's to acknowledge them and understand them, but not necessarily to agree with them, because we don't want to be in a position where we're promulgating certain tropes
Mm.
about migrants, certain things. Like, and I'll just note them. And I know that that wasn't the intention in what you're trying to say, but I just want to be sure that, incompatibility of Islam in, let's say, so-called Western culture. I think that is a trope. That is a negative trope. And whether that's actually true is something else, something that we can find out, through the process of learning about each other and histories. Most Muslims, most moderate Muslims, and I know many, having lived in Muslim countries, but also in Europe, for example, which has large Muslim populations, and part of the European history, and which also the US and North America connects itself to through the migratory process that, the Europeans moved here. So Europeans themselves also have a strong Muslim history, Muslim communities that weren't incompatible. That the different religions and the races and the communities, there's many examples in history where they lived in peace and solidarity and so on. That has changed over time as there has been competition potentially for resources, as you're saying, Mark. And I think that's another trope that we have to be careful about, is that migrants come to benefit from the welfare of another state, that they're coming here to take benefits, they're not coming to contribute, which is really, I mean, statistically, it's quite the opposite. I mean, there's so many studies about migration, improving the economy, migrants contributing taxes, even sometimes higher taxes, and so on. So there's like, I think a lot of misunderstandings. This potentially, it really depends on which view. I mean, you can find statistics about anything these days. So, it depends what positions you're taking. That we need to know more about each other, I think is the solution for creating of that one space. That one space is already happening. And I don't think that I don't know if we're not ready. I think there's a lot of, I think anytime there is resistance, that's where the shift is happening.
Mm.
So because there is so much resistance to migration, because there is such a polarizing, this means that we are in the process of transitioning into something new. I'd like to think that way. And that something new is a more shared space and equal space, not just in terms of rights, but in terms of knowing each other, all the different layers, all the integral layers of our psychology, of our feelings, our emotions, our culture, our background, our spirituality, and so on. It can be both compatible in a diverse way, and that's what the dream of multiculturalism is ultimately.
Right.
That we can all celebrate our differences together and thrive together, and that doesn't have to be some kind of utopic ideal that we're never going to go there, that it can actually be realized. And now it has to be realized because of climate change and environmental changes, where there's going to be so much mass movement. And it's not, by the way, just happening from the global south to the global north. A lot of movement and migration and displacement is happening because of climate change internally, even in the US,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So communities have to be more inclusive and accepting of each other, or not, or we can fight it out. I mean, we can have those are the options. I mean, this is what Terry Patton was saying in the opening of the book. I mean, this is where we could go. We can come together in this new republic of the heart, or we can just fight it out, because these environmental changes are going to create a lot of strife around the world.
Well, and this is my concern, Magdalena, because I think that everything you just said, brings us back to one of the original points that you made, that this is about the development of identity itself, right? I agree with everything you said about the various tropes around compatibility and resource use and all that. I agree with you from a world-centric perspective. But if I'm taking an ethnocentric perspective, which, by the way, like 60% of just this country in America is, I mean, that's where people are at by and large, it's a lot harder to come to those same conclusions without going through some process of ego development, identity development, etc. You talked about how there within Europe there's these open borders, which has been an emergent over the last couple decades, really. I mean, a European identity that transcends all of these different national identities has been emerging in a very strong way in that region of the world, and that allows sort of societies that were once maybe a little bit more monocultural to plug themselves into a more European kind of pluralistic experience. Well, obviously we have an analog of that here in America. I mean, there's no wall separating Colorado from Nebraska. I can go to Nebraska, anytime I want to, because we have a shared identity as Americans that supersede sort of our local ethnic groups and so forth. So it comes back to this emergence and continued emergence of this sort of Russian nested doll of identity. And I think that what we need at this point, I mean, unfortunately, we're dealing with these life conditions at a time where we're seeing a lot of regressive forces beginning to impact our sense of identity, both on the political left and on the political right. I'm just speaking within sort of the sphere of American culture. I'm sure there's analogs for this elsewhere, but social media is basically making ethnocentrists of us all, right? It's sort of like we flipped a switch one day and looked in our screens and saw billions of people staring back at us, and that freaked us out. And rather than having the curiosity to learn more about each other, instead we just sort of kind of cloistered ourselves into these little groups of like-minded people who will never challenge our assumptions and our biases and so forth. This is just kind of the shape of the world today, and I don't think it's always going to take this shape, right? But for now, the shape of the world is actually preventing this kind of development of identity, I think, from occurring. And that's another one of these big problems that we have. And this is why every time it's an election season, what do we hear about? Another migrant caravan heading to the southern border. Without fail, every election season, there's a new caravan coming over, and there's a lot of reasons why you at home need to be very, very concerned about barbarians infiltrating our civilization and tearing it down from within. This is sort of the ethnocentric view, and it's not altogether clear to me how we create a breadcrumb trail that can sort of lead as many people as we need to sort of escape this ethnocentric thinking. I'm not sure what there is to do there. I'm not even sure it's our prerogative to elevate people's minds. I mean, isn't that sort of a colonialist kind of use of integral ideas and language? I mean, we shouldn't want to force anyone to transform. We just want people to be healthy and civil wherever they happen to be. So this, I think, brings us back into the dilemma of what do we do about this now, particularly taking into account the current shape of the lower right quadrant and how information just simply moves these days.
Well, I mean, part of this is, if I go back a little bit, like when you have a welfare state that's based on means and it isn't universal, you're going to have winners and losers, right? Like the folks that are able to, that are making just enough to be off of welfare are going to be resentful of the people that are getting it, at that point. And so, and we've created this class conflict where, wage earners, right? The working class, they should want employers to compete with one another to bid for, scarce workers by raising wages. And you're kind of seeing that in the United States right now with wages going through the roof at McDonald's and various places. But at the other side, employers, right? They want a surplus of workers to compete for jobs and accept lower wages. And so when you have undocumented folks, no fault of them, but they're going to do that. They're going to drag that salary piece down. And there is evidence of that. And it's no fault of their own, right? And they are leaving horrific situations. It was really interesting this morning talking with Nicole, who works in primary care medicine and deals with a bunch of folks that are undocumented and sees the conflict like beautiful contributors to society, because she works at a clinic for impoverished folks, sees the beautiful gifts to society, but also sees the weight on the system that is created at the same time. And so, and this whole stuff with the caravan, right? Like we have a history in the United States of treating, demonizing folks from the south of the border and not the northern border. I mean, we used to do stuff like the Germans learned from us about gas chambers because we would gas people to clean them because we thought they were so dirty when they would cross the border in the 1920s and early 30s. And they literally learned from us to do that. Then they used DDT on humans to clean them because they're so dirty from the southern border. And we created these images of these humans being criminals, of being, and ideas for eugenics came from that. There's a congressperson who talked about the feeble-minded nature of people, of brown-skinned people, right? So we've got a history of not seeing the equal dignity of all people. We've got a system that's means-based, which creates haves and have-nots. And so I see these as deep problems in the system that we have to, get beyond to get to the point of the world centric point of view, the cosmopolitan citizen. But we've got a long history behind this and systems in place that aren't helping us do it.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, well, I see one comment
I was just gonna read that. Should I read that
Okay,
out loud?
go for it. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna
Yeah.
read this because it's a great comment. So Scott says, we kind of sort of have a shared reality in the USA. We seem to be having a stronger and stronger division of tribal versus green plus. Scott, I completely agree with you that whatever sort of cohesion of identity we've been able to enjoy in this country is now under serious threat. Americans are othering each other like crazy these days, and it's getting increasingly dangerous. So I totally agree with that point. And then he says, I'm 100% okay with force educating the tribalists in new integral thinking if they want the benefits that come with an integral society. As Ken Wilber says, just seeing the growth matrix has a psychoactive effect. I agree that seeing that simply learning integral ideas can have a psychoactive effect for those who, let's just say, have the fertile mind for those seeds to actually bear fruit. I'm not sure if we dropped a map of the altitudes, for example, onto a Christian fundamentalist's map, that all of a sudden his eyes would widen and the toothpaste would come out of the tube and you'd never be able to put it back in again, and all of that. That said, I do think that there is some precedent for I'm hesitant to use the word force because I don't think force is really the way to do it. But we've talked, for example, about how the United States Constitution has sort of an interesting trick to it, where it basically, ideally anyway, right, when it's working well, what it's doing is it's enforcing minimally orange behaviors, right? But it has nothing to say about pre-orange cultures or thoughts or anything in the interiors. But when it comes to behaviors, there's a line of enforcement, and that line of enforcement says we basically kind of expect you to behave according to these orange plus principles. And if you don't, there's going to be, some consequences for that. So I think and we could see that as being sort of a type of force, right? If you transgress these behavioral conditions, then force will be used in order to, punitively, in order to, to deal with the transgression. So there is some precedence for sort of higher stages using this kind of force. Maybe it's a more subtle force, but it's still a force. There's a legal and political, power behind it. I'm not sure exactly what the integral version of that looks like. I know Ken has come out with crazy ideas like let's measure how many perspectives each citizen is capable of taking, and then the number of votes they receive is based on the total. And I'm just like, God, Ken, let's imagine the central bureaucracy that's going to be in charge of assigning perspectives to people and doling out, a certain number of votes based on that. That might be a little pie in the sky, but at least it's creative problem solving.
I mean, we do force you to go to school till you're 16, some states 18.
Yeah, and guess what? We force you to get certain vaccines, for example, in order to be in those public schools. Yeah.
So it's I think it's probably I think Scott's probably a little bit ahead of our time in terms of what forced, what that might be. I could see, because we're doing, we force certain stages of our evolutionary process to reflect our current values, right? As a collective society. And that's what your constitutions in each country come to represent, and how we interpret them, and things like that. So
green is exerting a lot of force.
What's that?
Green is exerting a lot of force right now, a lot of downward force in terms of trying to regulate our culture and our society. saying, these things you're allowed. They're sort of redefining sort of the zone 4 rules of cultural discourse, right? These things you're allowed to talk about, these things you're not allowed to talk about. There are, whereas the Constitution has sort of, legal punitive kind of measures that it uses. A lot of green uses cultural shaming, for example, as its form of punitive measures in order to keep people in their place. So, force definitely gets used up and down the spiral in all sorts of interesting ways. And I do think there probably is an integral analog to that, but my sense is that it's going to feel, well, it's not going to feel like the type of oppressive, amber or even sort of green/amber forces that we're so used to in our culture these days.
Yeah. So what I'll add is that the integral analog can be found in the form of international law that supersedes the Constitution. Should, of course, states have to willingly take part in international law. They have to comply with international law, other than the use of force being actually through, well, we talked about it last time, military force or economic sanctions and so on. And that's certainly not what we need. So for the time being, it's more diplomatic measures and these softer influences. But now that we have these values and there are more and more which are evolving, international law is continually evolving as well. More people have a language of it. More people have a direct relationship where their state, if their state is not complying with the kind of society, the kind of equitable society that they think we should have within the states, in between states, then they're reaching out to international law and international communities. And this is what I'm finding really fascinating, is how communities are coming together through different citizen assemblies. So through global assemblies or through transnational assemblies. For example, right now, the COP26, the climate talks, the UN climate talks is happening in Glasgow. So it's like, this is the biggest UN meeting of our times, they say, because it's really going to determine of how things go forward. In advance of those meetings, different transnational citizen assemblies have gotten together, including a global citizens assembly. So they take participants from different parts of the world that are really representative of age, gender, diversity, different socioeconomic backgrounds. They come together and they make recommendations, proposals that they put forward either to the UN in the climate talk discussions, or, for example, the European Union, if it's a European transnational citizens assembly. And some of and there's also been national citizen assemblies, even in the US, there's been ones in Canada and so on, that have informed the legislative process. So it's really citizens taking it on themselves, saying, we don't like the laws, or the laws are not good enough to guide our society. So we're going to come up with treaties and declarations and regulations. And maybe that might not have the force of law just yet, but it has some kind of, I think, influence in the social space that could ultimately affect legislation. And I think that's a very, very positive turn. So I think a lot of people are taking it on themselves. This, and again, back to one of the things that Terry Patton talked about was sacred activism. Yes. Really taking it on. We're not waiting until governments, tell us what to do and how we're going to behave, or to educate us, or to be educated. We're going to educate ourselves, and we're going to take these ideas forward, and we're going to incorporate it into the systems that we want to create. And that's very powerful. So a soft force, not forcefully, but with influence.
Well, and I'm hoping that soft force becomes increasingly hard as we go, because, when Ken and I started doing the Ken Show, geez, I don't know, 2 years ago, one of our first episodes, we were talking about, again, another one of the central life conditions of our time, which I think plays into the immigration story a lot. And that is the fact that politically, we are stuck at the level of the nation state. And yet economically, we have seen the emergence of transnational hold-ons. And those transnational hold-ons exert a lot of power, and yes, a lot of force when it comes to sort of what is going on within the borders of any of these nation states, right? This is one of the biggest problems that we have, because currently there's no way to regulate the transnational economy. We haven't had an equivalent hold-on emerge in a transnational way that has enough teeth to really put these transnational corporations in their proper place and hold them accountable for all sorts of issues, from environmental issues to exploiting workforces, to unsustainable activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we have this sort of the problem of plutocracy, of an unregulated plutocracy. And what you're saying makes me hopeful, Magdalena, that we're beginning to see some more traction in terms of actual strategies that are capable of regulating this new transnational economic hold-on that we find ourselves in. Because otherwise, these nation states just find themselves subject to these transnational companies. We find, things like regulatory capture, where, it only costs $1 million, which is pennies to the dollar for these corporations, to buy off a politician and deregulate an entire industry so that your profits, can be maximized. It's a really, really tricky problem that nation states alone do not have the mechanisms to address. And that's why I think we're seeing so many of our nation states getting kind of co-opted. We're seeing so much corruption, which then damages our sense of legitimacy in our governing institutions and our media institutions. Because, hey, guess what? Our media institutions are owned by these same transnational companies. And so there's a healthy cynicism and skepticism that quickly slides into unhealthy kind of nihilism, right? When we don't see a way to deal with these problems. And of course, these are the same corporations that run outlets like the New York Times or Fox News and are injecting the culture with these tropes and narratives that are actively preventing more integral, more skillful, more compassionate solutions from emerging. So it makes me hopeful, Magdalena, that you are seeing some traction being made sort of within these international agreements. And my hope is that they have enough gravity to them and enough traction that they can actually hold the transnational economic hold-ons into account.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I I look for those trends, but whether they're working, it's always hard to say. We have to study them. But I would definitely like to see a system, a reality where people migrate because they want to migrate, because they can, rather than because they have to migrate, because they have no other choice, because life is so miserable. That's the good versus bad migration. I mean, we want migration. Migration is good in itself, if it's something that we have a choice in.
Yeah. No, beautiful.
I think to get to where we're, nation states are become a thing of the past, and to a healthier place where folks are moving naturally, as you described. There's things that have to happen internally within our countries to kind of create the space for that. And so, I was, things like I was writing down where we create more, a system where, like in the United States, wouldn't it be kind of cool where if undocumented immigrants were given, like, we just said, screw it, we're gonna have a universal salary for low wage people across the board that do the hard labor stuff that the technology hasn't taken over yet. And we're just going to say, screw it. We're going to allow them to be in a union and with collective bargaining rights, and where it's not the have versus have not, where I resent you. We're actually all in this together, and with a workable wage. Like, what a difference that would make in terms of creating the space for us to grow, to see each other as human beings, which allows us to build the space for world-centric awareness, and which allows us to move beyond nation states to becoming cosmopolitan citizens. But we've got to take these internal steps in our country. And, it's really tragic how, in politics is part of this, right? So I was telling you earlier how, historically the Democrats have actually been the party that was kind of like limiting immigration because they were, the working party. They were the party of labor.
Yep.
And now, like labor.
There is no party of labor anymore.
There is no labor, private industry labor. There are, public labor unions, but private labor unions is down to 6% in our country. It's basically obsolete. And so, Trump and the Republicans have become the working party, the working class folks. And that's tragic because it feeds, it certainly feeds on ethnocentrism and division and blame and, and based on facts that aren't really true about crime and all kinds of stuff like that. So, again, coming back, a lot of work to be done, but there are things that we could do, and that's just one example, in my opinion, that could get us closer to the cosmopolitan citizenry that we all deserve and we all are. That's who we really are.
Yeah.
There is no New Hampshire, there's just beautiful land and space that you can see these beautiful leaves out there that are coming down over here.
And I'm okay with the lines on the map. I mean, we can keep the lines on the map. They just become a little bit more transparent. You know what I mean? We don't see them like when I think of the line on the map between Colorado and Nebraska, it exists, but it's not so opaque. You know what I mean? Whereas when we relate to our national boundaries, we kind of bring this level of opacity to how we imagine those boundaries that we don't apply to sort of, within the nation, for example.
Well, I mean, when you like stand on a border, whether you're standing on a border in the United States, between states, or with Mexico or Canada, it's like you cross these border towns. It's like, what the hell's the difference? You know what I mean? Like it's so silly. Like once we really kind of dig in a little bit, like, I love the fact that I'm like an hour and 30 minutes from Canada right now, like I love that, oh, Canada. I mean, I love getting my French on in Quebec, crossing that border and the language being different. But like you could be looking at a lake and you're like, I don't know where that is. That could be New Hampshire. That could be Vermont. That could be Canada. That could be the Lake District of Canada that we love to go to. So, here's to cosmopolitanism. Here's to seeing all beings in that way. Let's keep moving. And I'm glad, I agree with you, Corey. Let's, Magdalena, beautiful stuff to be seen on the international scene. And may we move towards valuing that more, right? Like we struggle with that in the United States. Yes, the United Nations lives here, but I've driven by. I remember when I was a lawyer many years ago, I used to drive by a sign that said, "Keep the UN out of the United States." I was like, it was funny. I mean, I was like, this guy hates the United Nations, like it was this farmer guy. And it was just like a giant sign. Yeah. And, it's like, it's just kind of crazy. So, let's move in that direction, but let's internally get some things right. Like, let's make some laws that create the space to honor people in our land and not make it that you're a have and have not like that.
Totally. And I think a big part of that too, Mark, is also sort of making object out of a number of shared subjects that we have just been immersed in from birth. Right. So again, one of the things that we've occasionally talked about in shows like this is how, guys, we've lived ever since 1980, we've lived in sort of the neoliberal economic era. And there are a number of judgments of sort of often surreptitious judgments that come out of that neoliberal orientation, where, for example, we tend to value people's extrinsic skills. We place extrinsic value on people. You are as valuable as the value you are capable of creating for other people, right? Which is a shift away from sort of, a sense of having an intrinsic value and an extrinsic value, for example. And then that filters into how we make our decisions with immigration. Like you were just talking about, we sort of cherry pick what kind of immigrants we want to bring in here. Oh, let's put a priority. And America is definitely not the only country that does this. Let's just be clear. It is really hard for an American to migrate to another country unless we have wealth or skills that are immediately applicable, right? So this is not, an American thing at all, but I think that we can see sort of the residue of these neoliberal kind of judgments that we sneak into it, where you are more valuable if you have wealth, access to wealth, or you're capable of generating wealth. Ken Wilber and Roger Walsh a couple of years ago did a dialogue together, which we titled, and I'll link it down on the page down there, called Unitas Multiplex. And they were talking about a more integral, a more developmental approach to our notions of diversity, saying, guys, we can't only operate from notions of diversity that reduce people only to their ethnic identities. We need to actually have a developmental diversity as well. And the way that factors in is we begin to understand that, well, if we're only selecting immigrants who either have wealth or skills or et cetera, more highly developed immigrants, that is an uncompassionate move. Whereas if we only let in sort of the unskilled people, right, the refugees who are escaping just dire situations in their own regions, if we only let them in, well, that's probably unwise. And we want to make immigration decisions that are both compassionate and wise, right, simultaneously. So we need to make room for both of these. But I think that we're all sort of wearing these neoliberal lenses that tend to cause more of us to value one side of that equation more than the other. And that's tricky, because I don't think we're going to be able to make that subject into an object until we've moved on into whatever the next big economic paradigm coming down the road is going to be.
Well said.
One thing that I wanted to say about the Canadian border, because I was thinking, gosh, how obvious is it that there is a distinction between what happens on the U.S.-Mexico border and the U.S.-Canada border? You made me think of that, Mark, that you just want to cross the border. Well, it turns out that the U.S. is building a fence along the border with Canada. Right now, brand new information, breaking news. I just learned this as well. So there really is this kind of thinking along vulnerable spaces with the Canadian border. And there are, pictures of these couples sitting on the border, like international love, and now they can't cross over as easily because of these borders that are going up. So that is the current reality that is also applying to Canada as well. Now, about the economic value. So I just want to give an example of my family. I mentioned that we went from Poland through Italy, through that refugee process. We came to Canada as immigrants. So we were migrants, refugees, and then we got the immigrant status once we were in Canada. And both my parents are skilled. My mom was a teacher, my dad was trained an engineer. They've had lots of experience in businesses. When we got to Canada, they really could only get kind of manual labor jobs at factories, at cleaning, janitorial jobs, things like that. And that's what they ended up doing for years and years. So a lot of their professional and educational ambitions had to be abandoned, even though they had that, even though they were, potentially selected and invited to be here because of their skills, they could not practice that. So the way that we are treating people once they arrive also makes a difference. And that makes a difference of what happens at the borders. What happens at the borders is absolutely critical. And there's violent things happening at the borders. I mean, the U.S. border there was just a report from Human Rights Watch about about even sexual abuse happening, committed by border guards, just really, really, really violent acts, and also socioeconomic deprivation. For example, at the European borders right now, there is a standoff where groups of migrants, asylum seekers are not being let in and are being deprived of basics from both sides of the border. So nobody's helping them out. They're deprived of food, of shelter, and there have been cases of deaths on the border as a result. I have written about this. So this is, I mean, this is like beyond lack of compassion. This,
Yeah.
this to me is just cruelty. This is inhumane.
The cruelty is the point, they often say.
Yeah, and it's really not a recognition of the others humanity, and that has an effect not just on the people. I mean, clearly on the people that are suffering and dying as a result, but the kind of thinking that we have about these systems altogether, and the repercussions and the trauma. I mean, these people have children, and these children grow up with the memories of this happening. You know, we want to, some states have these ideas about not creating socio and economic pull factors, not being too nice to migrants and asylum seekers because they might want to come.
Right.
And so they have these policies of mistreatment.
Yep.
That causes so much harm,
Yes.
much harm beyond whatever this idea about pull factors might be. It causes really psychological, physical, spiritual, emotional, like, I mean, all these layers of harm that are transcended in the individuals and the families and the societies and the cultures and the perceptions of what they send back home in their countries of origin, and ultimately, and contributing to conflicts among human beings. This is serious stuff. So the way we treat people, and against international law, because the laws already exist, the rules are out there. We're not supposed to be behave this way. We know basic morality of goodness and compassion, and it's already embedded into our national and international laws for the most part, and yet it's still happening. So we really have to, think about our human nature, humanity, what it is, how do we influence others, how do we have these kinds of conversations in our communities, and be really, really careful on the one hand, and also active in ensuring that more inclusive, more compassionate, more humane, and more ideas in line with international and national morality are being put into place. That's what we need to do.
Beautifully
Well,
and passionately said. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to kind of summarize and close up what I think we wanted to try to accomplish, and what we hope is seeing each other with the equal dignity of all beings, and that has to happen at the border. It has to happen internally inside of how we inhabit our countries now, and we need to move to a place that transcends the nation state to recognize the equal dignity of all beings, and see the border, as you said eloquently, Corey, too, like, see the border, but not take it as seriously as we have historically taken it.
Yeah.
And really come to appreciate the differences of the different cultures, as opposed to being threats on our being. So, once again, guys, I'm actually more jazzed about this now and want to dig into it even more. And I didn't know where this was going to go, but this has been a really beautiful discussion. Thank you both.
I always feel like these are like setting up multiple new discussions to come down the line.
Yeah.
Sorry, my cat has just immigrated onto my lap, so he's making himself known. No, and thank you both. This has been an awesome conversation. And just to close, I want to address, Scott had a final question. Do you think that people should have similar results, like we all make the same income or same opportunity? So this is a classic divide, and I think it impacts the question of immigration too. My sort of short takeaway is I believe in equal opportunities, and I believe in more equitable inequities. In other words, I understand that equal opportunities will almost always result in some kind of inequity, but I want those inequities to be far more equitable than they are today. I know we're always going to have unequal wealth distribution, for example. That is inevitable. In fact, it's probably a little bit preferred, but we probably don't want it to be as inequitable as it is today because that is unsustainable. And I try to apply that same kind of moral judgment to issues like immigration or economics or what have you.
I think Mark and you and I had a quick chat about it separately, about the issue of equality and how we discuss it within the integral word. I think that's a good one to come back to as well, because equality isn't an easy concept, and yet it is so important, and we can unpack that.
Yeah, Scott, we'll come back to that, buddy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just had a student quiz me the other day, really bright kid, asking me like kind of those Socratic questions about what really matters on that. And where do you come down, Professor? I'm like, God, you're brilliant. I'm like, I love you already, man. So, and I love you both. And,
I love you, man. I love you, Magdalena.
Love you guys as well.
Thank you so much for your passion. And, finally, we love you, Terry Pat, and thank you for all you've done to inspire not only this actual show that we did just now, but our continued integral emergence in the world. Thank you so much, and rest well, my friend.
And happy Halloween, everybody.
Happy
Have
Halloween.
some fun for those of you that celebrate, and Day of the Dead coming up.
A
beautiful, beautiful holiday
that
we will celebrate.
Definitely.
Ciao.
All the best.
All right, guys. Take care. Until next time.